Alrighty, well, I'm going to start the introduction. I suspect others will be joining us as we continue. So I'll try to talk for a little while to give them time to not miss the main event. But welcome, everyone. My name is Ansi Kamel. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Davenant Press and the senior editor of our journal Ad Fontes, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to Eric Hutchinson's lecture. So first, I just wanted to give a couple of opening remarks about the Davenant Institute and about Davenant Hall, which is the sort of program of the Davenant Institute that's hosting this. And then I'll introduce Eric. So the Davenant Institute's mission, as some of you are probably aware, is recovering Protestant wisdom for the contemporary church. And the Davenant Institute was founded with the belief that there were deep riches in the Protestant tradition that were not being mined and appropriated well in our own day, or in some cases, weren't known at all. And so the Davenant Institute's goal is to recover those resources precisely because those resources can help us think through our own situation, to analyze our own context, and to make decisions in our own time and enrich our understanding of the faith. So that's our goal, recovering Protestant wisdom for the contemporary church. So everything we do is rooted in the tradition, in the Protestant tradition, but for the purpose of applying it to our own day. And we've from day one have been adamant about the fact that this sort of project is best undertaken by a network of friends. We affectionately call it an army of friends. But the point is that theology is built and shared through real relationships with one another. And to that end, Davenant Hall was started a couple of years ago as a means of making the Davenant Institute's resources and our knowledge and our network of friends accessible to people all over the world. And we do have students from all over the world. So Eric Hutchinson, who's a longtime friend of the Institute and a friend of mine, is one of our teaching fellows at Davenant Hall. And he also writes for the website Ad Fontes. So I'm delighted to have him here. Eric is a professor of classics, associate professor of classics at Hillsdale College. He's the chairman of their collegiate scholars program. He got his BA at Hillsdale and then got his PhD at Bryn Mawr College. And he's been at Hillsdale since 2007. And a lot of his work focuses on looking at how the classical authors are interpreted and engaged with by early modern authors. But his research really is quite comprehensive. It's very impressive. He's recently translated Niels Hemmingson's book on the laws. And now he's here to talk to us about Augustine, St. Augustine, and Horace. So if you will please give Eric a warm welcome, I will stop blathering now and he can get to it. So Eric, thank you very much for being here.
All right, great. Thank you, Anzi. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's here. I'm looking at the list. It seems that perhaps my topic didn't have quite the reach, quite the appeal that that it has for me. But the size of the group doesn't matter. We'll have just as much fun, I suppose, with whoever it is that's here, regardless. And I'll just sort of jump in and get started. If you decide along the way that you've made a huge mistake, that's fine. I think it's entirely possible on Zoom to leave without fanfare, without really making a big scene. Of course, if you want to make a big scene, I guess that's up to you. That's your call. Although I suppose we could mute you if that happened, if things got too out of hand. But in any case, the title of the talk that I'm giving tonight is Maps of Misreading. Horace's Virgil in Augustine's Horace. I suppose I'll sort of take it for granted, I guess, that that we're all at least roughly familiar with Augustine, with the outlines of Augustine's life. His dates are 354 to 430, but I won't say a whole lot about him by way of biography, although some of what I'll be dealing with in the talk is biographical in the nature of the case, insofar as the confessions are biographical or have some affinity with biographical literature. Horace may be a little bit less familiar. So let me just give you some dates. I mean, Augustine's 4th century, 5th century, born in 354 and dies in 430. Horace is alive and active during the last century BC, born in 65 BC, and he dies in 8 BC. So his active period overlaps with the coming to power of Octavian, and then later with Augustus, the Emperor Augustus. Horace was part of the close inner circle of a man named Maecenas. Maecenas was a right-hand man of the Emperor Augustus, the kind of person we would think of as a sort of patron of the arts, and he gave support, particularly financial support, to a number of the most important Roman poets who existed, and certainly the most important of their day. Chiefly Horace and Virgil, and Horace and Virgil were friends with each other. We'll get into that a little bit today. Horace was a poet. The major works of his that we have are a set of poems called the Odes, a set of literary epistles, several satires in verse, and finally the work for which he is best known now, though that hasn't always been the case, in fact. The work for which he's best known now is the Odes, and I'll be talking about one of Horace's Odes today, and that is the third poem of the first book of the Odes. And I think what I'll do, I had sent a PDF around of a handout, so I hope that you all have access to it, that you can pull it up on your screen, because I'm going to be referring to it several times, at least 10 or more throughout the course of the talk. So if you have access to that, that would be good. You'll want to take a look at that. I've given you both the Latin text of the poem and an English translation, not a fancy English translation, nothing sort of artistic about it, which is unfortunate because the poem itself has a great deal of artistic merit, whereas my translation does not. However, I hope that it at least does enough to communicate the sense of the poem, so that you'll kind of have it in mind in general terms for our discussion. So I'm just going to read through it. The poem's 40 lines long. I'm going to read through it, and then I'll jump into the remarks that I have to make to you about it. So Horace says, "Thus may the goddess powerful over Cyprus, thus may the brothers of Helen, light-giving stars, and the father of the winds, all restrained except the northwest wind, guide you, O ship, who, O Virgil, entrusted to you. From Greece may you return him unharmed, I pray, and preserve for me the half of my soul. That man had oak and triple bronze around his chest, who first entrusted a fragile raft to the grim sea. The first, not fearing the headlong southwest wind, fighting with the north winds, nor the gloomy Hyades, nor the rage of the south wind, than which there is no greater, whether he wishes to raise or to calm the waves. What step of death did he fear, who looked with dry eyes on swimming monsters, who looked at the swelling sea and the infamous cliffs Acrocoronea? In vain did wise God cut off the earth from the unsociable ocean, if wicked rafts will overleap the depths that should not be touched. Overbold to endure all, the human race rushes through forbidden evil. The overbold son of Iapetus brought fire to the human race by wicked deceit. After fire had been brought, oops, I forgot a T, but yeah, okay. After fire had been brought from its heavenly home, famine and a new gang of fevers brooded over the earth, and the previously slow necessity of far-off death shortened its step. Daedalus tested the empty air with wings not granted to man. The labor of Hercules burst through Acheron. Nothing is difficult for mortals. We attack heaven itself in our foolishness, and through our crime do not permit Jove to lay aside his angry thunderbolt. So this poem is, or at least is in the beginning of what's called a propempticon, a send-off poem. Virgil is going on a journey, Horace says, and he addresses this poem to the ship that is carrying him and says, hey, you got my friend on board, in fact, a half of my soul. Please don't let anything bad happen to him. That's how the poem starts, and this is a well-established genre, the send-off poem. But Horace then veers off in a different direction, and this has puzzled commentators for a long time, and in fact has often irritated them. There are a lot of commentators who don't think that this is a very good poem, or that it has no cohesiveness, that it doesn't all fit together. I don't really think that's true, but I don't have time to get into that today because it's not that's not my main topic. But you'll notice that he sort of veers into a diatribe against sailing, and he takes sailing as a as the kind of archetypal symbol of human beings not acknowledging the restraints that have been divinely imposed upon them, and so going out into territory that they had better avoid. And then he turns to mythological examples of this: Prometheus stealing fire from heaven and giving it to man, Daedalus trying to fly, Hercules going to the underworld, and ends with this sort of critique of human audacity. Nothing is difficult for mortals. He doesn't mean that as a compliment. We even try to scale heaven, and because of that, we provoke divine vengeance. We don't allow Jove or Jupiter to lay aside the thunderbolt, which is his instrument of vengeance. Okay, so that's just a summary of the poem, and so now we can go ahead and get started with the lecture proper. So almost 30 years ago, in an essay on allusion to Horace, Odes 1:3, in book 4 of Augustine's Confessions, Confessions 4:6, Joseph Pucci lamented the scant attention that had been devoted to the study of, quote, the literary element in Augustine's creative work, close quote. While there have been some developments in this area, particularly with respect to Augustine's use of Virgil, the intertextual relationship between Augustus and Horace remains remarkably understudied. Indeed, Horace doesn't even rate enough to make a list of Augustine's influences in a very important book by Henri Irénée Mareux, St. Augustine. I'll give you the title in English, St. Augustine and the End of Ancient Culture. This essay, or this talk, attempts to fill in one more piece of the puzzle of Augustine and Horace through the analysis of another allusion to the same poem that Pucci had treated, Odes 1:3, in a different spot in the Confessions, one that, to my knowledge, has not been previously noticed or discussed. A close reading of the brief allusion will show its relevance to its immediate context and that of Book 1 as a whole, as well as Augustine's sophisticated maneuvers in navigating the classical tradition. After demonstrating that the allusion is in fact an allusion, I'll widen the scope of discussion to show how it is situated in the unfolding narrative of the first book of the Confessions, and how it stretches forwards and backwards into other parts of the book. And finally, how it illuminates the much more well-known allusions to Virgil, which it complements, competes with, and corrects. The allusion I refer to comes in Confessions 1:13-20 and consists of only 2 words. At the end of a long sentence in which Augustine recounts his passionate involvement with the literary depiction of Dido, and this is 2A on the handout. He says, I was being compelled to keep in my memory the wanderings of some Aeneas, while forgetful of my own wanderings, errorum eorum, and to lament the death of Dido because she killed herself from love. Although I was enduring with dry eyes, sicis oculis, the fact that I myself was dying in these wanderings apart from you, God, my life. So the words in bold print, sicis oculis, refer the reader back to Horace Odes 1, 3, 20. So you can go and check that on the handout if you like. Part of the Propempticon to Virgil. The poem, like Augustine's Confessions, begins as a prayer, in Horace's case, for the safety of Virgil's ship and its precious cargo, the poet. But Horace then pivots to a diatribe against the first sailor and man's irrational desire to tempt fate on the open sea. And this is 2b. What step of death did he fear, quem mortis timuit gradum, who looked with dry eyes, sicis oculis, on the sea's monsters, who looked on the swelling sea and Acrocoronia's infamous cliffs. But the translation that I gave you at the beginning is slightly different, but that's okay, it comes to the same thing. So these two words, sicis oculis, may seem a slender peg on which to hang a weighty allusion. One might suspect that such a combination of words is common enough. As it turns out, however, it is not. Horace is the first to use that locution in extant Latin literature. In between Horace's Odes and Augustine's Confessions, the phrase sicis oculis occurs only twice. And the reverse, oculis sicis, does not occur at all. One of these, not that it matters a whole lot, but one of these instances is in Declamation 10 of a person we call Pseudo-Quintilian. The other is in a letter of Pliny the Younger. There's also a very close, a phrase that's very close to this in one poem of Propertius, so contemporary with Horace, sicis ocelis. But even of these later ones, take the one in Pliny, for example. These are presumably allusions to Horace in their own turn. Both are relevant to the Augustinian context in the Confessions in a very general way. That is, both have to do with death. But I don't have the space to treat them here. And what I'm going to do instead is focus on Horace as Augustine's chief source, which I think is legitimate to do, as I'll argue for in just a moment. So even though there are just a couple of parallels for this phrase in intervening literature, there are still very good reasons to assume that Augustine is taking it directly from Horace, from Horace's poem. And by the way, once we note, if you grant that sicis oculis is in fact an allusion to Horace, the reader can easily add this parallel between mortis and morientem. So the morientem in the Confessions passage about Augustine dying apart from God, and mortis in Horace's poem, what step of death, what approach of death did he fear, who looked with dry eyes on the swimming monsters. So it's beyond doubt that Augustine knew this poem, Odes 1-3, because as Pucci, the scholar I mentioned a couple minutes ago, notes in an essay called The Dilemma of Writing, Augustine Confessions 4-6, and Horace Odes 1-3, Augustine alludes to it definitively in Confessions 4. This is when he is referring to the death of a friend of his, and he does so via Horace's description of Virgil. Explicitly marking his words as a quotation, Augustine laments the loss of, quote, half of his own soul, close quote. This is in 3a and 3b in the handout. Dimidium animae mei, or dimidium, what Horace says is, hey, please preserve the half of my soul, animae dimidium mei. Augustine, his friend dies, and he's very sad about it. And he says, well, did someone say of his friend that his friend was, this is 3a, his soul's half, dimidium animae sui. So he's essentially saying, even though he doesn't name either person here, just as Horace called Virgil his friend, the half of his soul. Wow, that was a really perceptive thing to say, because that's exactly how I feel about this friend of mine who has just died. So the point here is that he certainly knew Augustine certainly knew this poem. So when we see what appears to be an unmarked allusion to Horace in Book 1, just these two words, sicis oculis, we can, I think, be confident that it is so, especially given the rarity of this combination of words. And although this tag has escaped notice up until now, what I'm going to argue is that it makes an even more sophisticated use of the Horatian intertext or source text than the allusion in Book 4, about half of the soul. But first, let me give you a few general remarks about Book 1 of the Confessions to set the scene, in order to catch the allusion in, as it were, its native habitat. Confessions 1, and I hope you've all read it. If you haven't, you really should. Confessions 1 is about memory and its failures, and learning by imitation and its dangers. That is, about learning to remember and to misremember by imitation. Much of the book is taken up with Augustine's account of school and play, and through all of it runs man's sin and guilt like a crack in glass. Confessions 1 begins, of course, with events which Augustine cannot remember, paradoxically, namely his gestation, birth, and infancy, and for the truth of which he must therefore rely on the testimony of others, as well as his observations of other people. And this is possible because everyone's infancy imitates everyone else's, including in its sinfulness. You may remember the example that he gives of two infants fighting over milk, right? So for him, this sinful tendency of human beings goes all the way back to the earliest stages of life. But it was not long before Augustine learned to speak. And indeed, this appears in 1:813 to be the first thing he is actually able to remember. So that his speech and his self, or at least his consciousness of himself, in a sense, emerged at the same time. If memory is a crucial component of identity, as it is for Augustine, we can say that Augustine now began to exist in a different way. It's a clumsy way of putting it, but I hope you'll be able to sort of get my meaning here. He began to exist in a different way with a greater reality of self-perception than he did before. There was now the self constituted by speech and memory. But this does not mean that imitation has been left behind. Such a self, as Augustine is describing, does not and cannot either come into existence or continue to exist on its own. It finds expression through the imitation of others. This was how Augustine learned to speak. He watched and listened and held the words he heard in his memory, he says, pensava memoria in 1:813. Thus, the speaking self is at the same time the imitative self. And as Augustine discovers by ex post facto reflection, that was precisely his problem. For it sent him into what he will shortly call the stormy society of human life, the agonistic arena in which men use speech for self-serving gain. Already in 1:914, he remarks that his fall into language, as we might call it, was ordered to his flourishing in this world in hoc saeculo florerem, by excelling in the tonguey arts, or the arts of the tongue, excellerem linguosis artibus, for the purpose of worldly honor and riches. Augustine connects his selfish perversity directly to his education. Indeed, the very next sentence after this begins, Inde in scholam datus sumut discarem litteras. From there, I was handed over to the school to learn letters and literature. There, his learning took on a new complexion. That is, it occurred not only through imitation, but also through compulsion. Augustine claims in 1:915 that he was not a good student. He loved extracurricular play too much. It says in 1:915, delectabat ludera, it was pleasing to play. And this play caused him to work less than he should at his schoolwork. Though in reality, schoolwork too was play or mockery, he says. He calls it ludificationes in 1:914. But Augustine, he liked to play ball, okay? And playing ball, ludebam pila, in 1:915, kept him from learning the rhetorical tricks by which he might play more immorally as an adult. De formius luderem, right? He was skipping out on the skills by which he might play in a more perverse, a more deformed way as an adult. He says this again in 1:915. Throughout this section, it should not be lost on the reader that the most common Latin word for school is ludus. So Augustine is playing a little etymological game here, a ludificatio of his own, with this sort of backing and forthing between talking about school and talking about the way that he played hooky, and was playing in other games which prevented him from learning how to play the type of play that the school was teaching him, which would allow him to excel and get the better of others later in life. So this is a little ludificatio of his own, but with a serious point. For Augustine, school was a joke told at the expense of his soul. Augustine will go on to give a more specific description of his literary study overseen by grammatici, these people who teach sort of literary interpretation in the Roman school. But an important event intervenes in his narrative between his initial description of school and his later, more detailed one. This event is not directly relevant to his education, but it is relevant to my argument about how he uses Horace and Virgil to narrate his education. The event I refer to is Augustine's nearly fatal illness, which you may remember, due to which he was almost baptized. His mom almost had him baptized when he got very ill and they thought he might die. And so Monica, his mother, came very close to having him baptized, but Augustine got better. He recovered. This is like the person in Holy Grail who was turned into a newt, right? But he recovered. In the same way, Augustine recovered from this illness. And so his washing, his lavacrum, 1:11:17, his washing in the waters of baptism was deferred. As a result, Augustine suggests that the reins of sinning, Laura peccandi, were relaxed for him. Right? So he wasn't restrained as he would have been had he been baptized. So that he would be inundated after boyhood with what he calls the waves of temptation, fluctus temptationum. And we're going to return to his baptism later. For now, just note that this is what comes in between, is sort of, if you think of it like a triptych, right? We've got early school, then later school, and right in the middle is this account of his near baptism. Okay, so Augustine then resumes the narrative of his educational progress in 1:12:19, where we learn that he disliked learning his letters. The term he uses is literas, and that word can refer both to basic literacy and to literature. The word is ambiguous. Although that's the case, however, Confessions 1:13-20 makes it clear that what Augustine hated was learning what we call the 3 R's, sort of oddly. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. The Latin terms that he uses are in fact exactly parallel to this: legere et scribere et numerare, to read and to write and to count, or to number, to do arithmetic. And Augustine hated learning these 3 things as much as he hated learning Greek in general. And he's quite clear that he did not enjoy learning Greek at all. Augustine attributes this to his own sinfulness. This is, it's sort of as not at the time, of course, but in later reflection, he says, wow, that was really rotten of me. Must be because I'm such a huge sinner. So he attributes this to his own sinfulness, which he caps with an allusion to Psalm 78 or Psalm 77 in the Vulgate and Septuagint numbering. Caro eram et spiritus ambulans et non revertens. I was flesh and spirit walking about and not returning. That's how he describes his folly as a schoolboy. So he hated learning the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. He hated learning Greek. However, as a child, Augustine passionately loved adamaveram, Latin literature, as it was taught by these grammatici that I've mentioned, by these teachers of poetry, and of the sort of close exegesis and analysis of the Latin poets, figures of style, figures of speech, all this kind of thing. So the teaching of the grammatici was a pedagogy that focused primarily on the memorization and exegesis of the great Roman poets. Augustine loved this. It is no accident that it is in this context, as Augustine notes that he had committed Virgil's Aeneid to memory, that the allusion to Horus that I've already read, the Sicis Oculis, occurs. From several decades removed, Augustine says that he had his priorities and his loves exactly backwards while he was in school. Basic literacy allowed him to read whatever he came across and therefore had a functional superiority to Roman literature. But it also had a moral superiority, for it did not compromise the state of his soul, as he says that the deep study of Virgil did. And this is let me see where it is. This is 2a in the handout. The study by which, he says, I was being compelled to keep in my memory, I've already read it, that's why it's up there on the page. I was being compelled to keep in my memory the wanderings of some Aeneas while forgetful of my own wanderings, and to lament the death of Dido because she killed herself from love, although I was enduring with dry eyes, sicis oculis, the fact that I myself was dying, morientem, in these wanderings apart from you, God, my life. This is what I read earlier. So now we're just looking at it a second time. Okay, Augustine then proceeds famously to compare the errores, the wanderings of Aeneas, with his own errores, wanderings or errors. The allusion to Horace serves as a cap to the introduction to the discussion of Virgil that follows. In this way, it serves a purpose analogous to that of the allusion to Psalm 77 or 78 mentioned above. The latter from the Psalms, Augustine uses to criticize his hatred of gaining basic literacy. The former allusion, the one from Horace, he uses to criticize his love for literature. So he hated the wrong thing and loved the wrong thing. He should have flipped them. He should have reversed them. Furthermore, as is so often the case with Roman allusivity, the tag, the allusion, is meant to recall the entire context from which it comes. This is true at least two different levels in this instance. First, it has been fairly common, not universal by any means, but fairly common to read Odes 1-3 and its prima facie bizarre turn to diatribe about the daring of the first sailor as an allegory of Virgil's undertaking in the Aeneid, right? So think about this for a second. The sailor, the passenger of the ship, is what I'm trying to say. The passenger of the ship in Horace's poem is going from Rome to Greece, and Horace asks the ship to bring its cargo back again safely. Horace then goes on to express sort of shock at the audacity of the person who invented sailing in the first place, trying this new thing, this brand new thing that had not been tried before. Well, this has been sometimes read, again, allegorically as a way of describing Virgil's project in the Aeneid, right? Virgil, as a Roman, going to Greece, as it were, right, to fetch Homer and Romanize him, right, to bring Greek poetry to the Latin world, and in some sense domesticate it, right, return and so make that journey, the metaphorical journey to Greece, to Greek literature, and bring it back and make it Roman. Okay, this is an incredibly sort of bold undertaking, one might say, and so this has been read again as potentially having reference to Virgil and his project in the Aeneid. Thus, the first sailor, the primus in Horace's poem, who feared neither storms at sea nor the quickening pace of death, and who looked with dry eyes, sicis oculis, at oceanic monsters, would be Virgil, or Aeneas, the central character of the poem, or both. Augustine displaces the referent of sicis oculis to himself, and this move sets up two contrasts between Virgil and Augustine. For Augustine could not do as he claims Virgil had done, and as Aeneas often does in the poem. Augustine's mind was transfixed by the wanderings of Aeneas while he neglected his own. He wept over the death of Dido while he was dispassionate about his own death apart from God. As a new Virgil, the school-aged Augustine wove a real-life tale of his own wanderings and death with a tearless distance. But unlike Virgil, Augustine is simultaneously author and text. His narrative is his textualized life, or a version of it, the reduction of a disordered past to ordered verbal form in the present, with the help of the ordered patterns of other texts, namely the Bible and classical Latin literature. This level of textual investment as both subject and object makes his disinterestedness in his spiritual death all the more horrifying to his later Christianized self-reading. The second and perhaps more significant level at which the Horatian ode is contextually appropriate is also intimately linked to Augustine's sort of intertextual reading of his own past. For the poem is a parable about original sin and the waters of judgment. As a poem about originary and archetypal human audacity, Odes 1-3 naturally lends itself to a Christianized rereading that is to a degree harmonious with the biblical narrative. Recall again that Horace's diatribe is directed against the first man, primus, in line 12, to take his ship to sea. In the poem, this action functions as a kind of peccatum originus, a kind of original sin, through which man crosses the boundaries God had put in place. Indeed, Horace marks it explicitly as an act of impious transgression. Right? He says that impious or wicked ships cross over transilion, cross over the waters that ought not to be touched, non tangenda. The audacious nature of this heinous act causes Horace to connect it to the trick of Prometheus, through which all the ills that plague mortal life were loosed on the earth. When he stole fire, he gave it to man, and there was divine vengeance as a result. The two are mutually reinforcing, for the Prometheus story gives a mythical account of the consequences of improper daring, the same thing that the sailing bit is about. The human race, Horace says, rushes through forbidden wickedness, ruit per vetitum nefas, in line 26. The story of Prometheus tells us what happens when divinely placed boundaries are crossed. There is therefore a sense in which the fire of the Prometheus myth has a function that is analogous in structural terms to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. Through both, in direct violation of the command of God, man's eyes are opened in a new way, and he becomes like God, provoking divine judgment. In the biblical narrative, this means death. In Horace's poem, it means the thunderbolt of Jove at the end of the poem. To sum up, then, the sea is, well, I suppose I should add this bit in here. That's true of Prometheus. It's also true of the desire for sailing. That also is structurally parallel, as I mentioned a minute ago, to this idea of a fall, of an original transgression that provokes wrath. And so the sea is, for Horace in this poem, a symbol of man's archetypal transgression that provokes the destruction of all men. Even as Adam's sin unleashes wickedness on the earth that culminates in the waters of judgment in the days of Noah. So it's no surprise that just as Augustine connects himself to the first sailor who looked dispassionately, sicis oculis, with dry eyes, on what should have terrified him in Odes 1-3, he also connects himself in the Confessions to the biblical Adam and to the divine vengeance that each of them provoked, this man in the poem and Adam in the Bible. The evidence is abundant. Augustine's famous description and dissection of his actions and motives in the pair episode in Confessions 2 has obvious and intentional affinities with the story of Adam in Genesis 3. But already in Book 1, he unmistakably connects his youthful toil and trouble to Adam's fall. As Augustine recalls being whipped in school for laziness, he comments, this is number 4 in the handout, "This was praised by my elders, and many who lived before us had constructed beforehand the wretched ways over which we were compelled to cross, with toil and pain multiplied for the sons of Adam." Filiis Adam. So he's one of these sons of Adam. There's a direct line from Genesis 3 to Augustine through the inheritance of sin, guilt, and toil. In the same way, Horace makes the corporate aspect of man's original fault clear at the conclusion of Odes 1-3. The poem begins with the second person addressed to Virgil's ship. "Hey, you ship, bring my buddy back safe." It then shifts to third person in the middle audacity section of the poem. "Wasn't this guy crazy? Yeah, wasn't this guy crazy? How about Prometheus? Yeah, they're all crazy." And then shifts to first person plural at the end to apply the divine judgment to us. Look again at what Horace says. "Nor due to our own fault, nostrum scelus, our crime, do we allow Jove to set aside his wrathful thunderbolt? So there's a corporate aspect to this, and Horace includes himself and all men in the guilt that is typified by the transgression of the first sailor. But there is a still deeper connection, I would argue, between Odes 1:3 and Confessions 1 and their similar theodicies. One can see this when the observations just made are linked to the narrative of Confessions 1 as a whole that was sketched above. As was noted there, the account of Augustine's near baptism is inserted between his account of learning to speak in the beginning of his basic formal education on the one hand, and his more detailed treatment of literary education that follows on the other. Now we return to that narrative interruption to attempt to account for why it is placed there. The answer, at least in part, rests on Augustine's Horatian lens. Greek and Roman thinkers regularly conceptualized the use of speech as connected in the closest possible way with human gregariousness and sociability. Augustine agrees, but with the dark caveat that human society in a state of sin is perverse. He therefore describes his acquisition of language as his introduction into society, yes, but more precisely as his entry into society's storm. In this way, it is, in a sense, as I already mentioned, his own original sin. Where classical thinkers made speech, oratio, the instrument for the manifestation of reason, ratio, Augustine makes it the instrument for the sinful manifestation of one's own will, voluntas. He writes that this is handout 5. Thus, with these among whom I lived, I communicated the signs used for giving voice to my wishes. Voluntatum enuntiandarum signa communicavi. And I entered more deeply into stormy society, or into the stormy society of human life. Vitae humanae procelosam societatem. I realize that I left a couple words off of the stormy society in the handout. It should read more deeply into the stormy society of human life. One recalls immediately that the sea in Odes 1:3, lines 12 through 16, is a place of fighting storm winds. An ocean, the theater of man's wicked daring, is called unsociable, dissociabili, in line 22. The term perhaps comes as a surprise when reading the poem. Not the first thing one would think of to say about the ocean. But it makes sense because the sea is an unnatural place for man, one that removes him from his proper environment of communal life on land. For Augustine, the paradox that society itself, metaphorized as a storm, can be at once social and unsocial is easily maintained. As he would later write in City of God 12:27, nothing is so discordant because of vice, so social by nature as the human race. Okay, so now we can come to baptism. In the Christian imagination, in one might say the Christian form of poetic knowledge, the remedy for death by water is life by water. The divine word in the waters of baptism might have done something to alleviate, even to reverse, Augustine's predicament caused by his entry into human society through corrupt human speech. But these life-giving waters were denied to him, and so he was only carried further along in the waters of death. And in fact, Augustine figures his corruption in just this way, namely through water imagery. He has already referred to waves of temptations, fluctus temptationum in 1:11-18, against which he was left unprotected because of the denial of baptism. Now he again uses water imagery in 2 consecutive paragraphs of his analysis of his education. First in 1:16-25, this is handout 6a, "Woe to you, river of human custom! Who could resist you? Sed why tibi flumen mores humani, quis resistet tibi." Next, in 1:16-26, the next paragraph, this is handout 6b, "Nevertheless, O river of hell, the sons of men are tossed in you along with their fees. Et tamen o flumen tartareum iactantur in te filii hominum cum mercedibus." Both of these statements occur after the allusion to Horace has been introduced in 1:13-20. And there is an echo of Horace's poem in each. In 1:16-25, what immediately follows the apostrophe to the river of human custom is the question, "Quam diu non sic haberis?" How long will you not be dry? After Sicis Oculis, the reader is primed to hear this as an extension of the Horatian Ode in Confessions 1. While Horace's sailor and the young Augustine were able to look on disaster with dry eyes, the world's waterways themselves continue on in their sinking swell. They are not to be dried up, certainly not for the unbaptized. Next, the rivers of human custom empty into the sea, and Augustine asks in handout 7a, how long will you roll the sons of Eve into the great and fearful sea, in mare magnum et formidulosum, which those who have climbed up on the wood scarcely get across? Quod vix transeunt qui lignum conscenderent. All of the elements that you see in bold in the handout can be read in Horatian terms. And you can take a look at 7b, where I've highlighted the relevant parallel terms in Horace's poem. Horace had expressed surprise about those who could unflinchingly look on the wild sea, the mare turbidum. Compare Augustine's mare magnum et formidulosum. And was shocked that wicked ships, impii rates, would hasten across, transilliunt, a verb that also carries the meaning of transgress. Augustine modifies the sea crossing, although he gives us a word that recalls Horace's verb, where Horace had transilliunt. Augustine gives us transeunt, again to go across. But he does replace the wicked ships with his own ship, the wood, the lignum, that is the cross. That's what lignum means here. And here is what that means, that substitution. The ark of Christ is the only way to cross the sea that terrified Horace. And this is precisely what he had missed out on by the delay of his baptism. So that's one Christian modification that Augustine makes to Horace's narrative. This modification is seconded by another difference from Horace's poem that shows even more clearly that Augustine's reading of Horace is anything but straightforwardly and one-sidedly positive. For notice what Augustine indicts in particular in this river of human custom. And by the way, that's a metaphor for reading classical literature. That's what the river of human custom is. Its portrayal of Jupiter. This is what Augustine indicts. Its portrayal of Jupiter as both supremely powerful and profoundly immoral. This is handout 8. Non ego in te legi et tonantem ioem et adulterantem. Didn't I read in you, O river? It's a weird thing to say to a river. Didn't I read in you? But again, the river, remember, is reading. The river is literature. Didn't I read in you about Jove both thundering and committing adultery? Now, Jupiter, of course, also appears in Odes 1-3. As we've already seen, the poem ends with a picture of Jupiter bringing righteous and thundering judgment to a wicked world. Again, recall the last stanza. We attack heaven itself in our foolishness, and through our wickedness, we do not allow Jove to lay down his wrathful thunderbolts. Through his treatment of the adulterous Jupiter, Augustine has complicated Horace's idealized picture of the ruler of gods and men. How can Jupiter be the punishing judge of the world, Augustine asks, when he is as bad as those he would judge? And so he deflates Horace's picture of the divine judge. Jove the Thunderer, he says, was merely invented in order to make Jove the adulterer exemplary by underwriting his adultery with divine authority. This becomes clear even clearer, I should say, in the next paragraph, 1:16-26. Okay, where another water image, I've already read it once, where another water image connects human custom, that is pagan literature, to hell. Flumen modus humani, flumen tartarium. Again, this is 6b in the handout. Okay, so in this paragraph, Augustine further develops his criticism of the divine example that has been set for human wickedness through an analysis of Terence's Eunuchus, a play by the Roman comedian Terence, where we see Jupiter, a depiction of Jupiter the adulterer. So in that play, Augustine says, Jove is an example of debauchery, exemplum stupri, and a heavenly magisterium, caelestium magisterio, for lust. He writes, quote, and this is Sarah Rudin's translation, but I've modified it slightly. Just look at how the young man lashes himself on in his lust. I suppose I should say, what's going on in the play is that a young guy looks at a painting, a picture of Jupiter coming to Danae in the form of a shower of gold, and says, well, look, I mean, if the chief god, the ruler of gods and men, can commit adultery, well, I certainly can too. Right, and the god can be an example for me. So Augustine writes, just look at how the young man lashes himself on in his lust, as if according to a heavenly magisterium. Oh, what a god, quoth he. At the sky's summit he thunders, with a wrenching, a roiling of heaven's precincts, and I, a petty mortal, wouldn't do it? No, I did it, and quite gladly. Right, so the god serves as a way of underwriting human debauchery. So these two modifications, that is his replacement of the impious ships, the impii rates, with the wood of the cross, the lignum, and the mockery of Jove as an adulterer, mark an important rupture with what had previously, in my reading, been a great sympathy between Odes 1:3 and Confessions 1. It seems that Augustine found Horace to be acute in his diagnosis of man's ills. However, when it came to the question of a solution for man's overweening and wicked daring, which Horace rightly observed, the gods of Horace's poem, the gods we encounter through reading pagan literature, can offer no assistance, as they are as bad as corrupt mankind. Indeed, they give human beings an impetus to be even worse. So much then for Horace's threats of Jovian judgment. This, we can say, thus he dispatches with the particular way in which Horace concludes the poem. There is an irony in the depth of Augustine's use of classical literature in these paragraphs when compared to what Augustine says on what we might call the surface of the text. As pointed out earlier, the main thrust of Augustine's polemic in this section of Confessions 1 is to laud basic literacy over the teaching of the grammarians. As he says in 1:1626, this handout 9, I do not accuse the words, which are, as it were, chosen and precious vessels, but the wine of error, which was given to us to drink in them by drunken teachers. Right, this is a biblical allusion, these chosen and precious vessels. Augustine says that's what these words are. And the words themselves are not immoral. It's what they're vessels that can hold different kinds of things. That is, they can be used for different purposes. And the teachers of error, or what he calls these drunken teachers, have poured the wine of error into the words. But here's the irony. In attempting to argue this very point, Augustine shows himself to be indebted to the same classical learning he castigates. For he makes his point via allusions to Horace and, as I was just discussing, to Terence. Without them, his argument would have much less imaginative power. How are we to interpret this seeming inconsistency or even contradiction? Right, this is the pagan literature is the river of hell, the river of human custom that empties out into the sea where we drown, basically, where all sort of bad things empty out. And yet here he is using in quite a subtle way this poem of Horace to make that very point. Obviously then doing some reading himself in this river of human custom. So what are we to do with this? How are we to interpret what appears to be a contradiction here? There are a couple of possible explanations, I think. It could be the case that Augustine proceeds in this way despite himself. He commits an oopsie. Right? The classical texts were just too impressed upon his mind for him to do otherwise. That's one possible explanation. Even if true, however, that explanation is not very interesting. And it is probably not true. Augustine was far too careful a writer for such a facile hypothesis to serve as a complete explanation. Alternatively, and more likely, his use of Horace is an example of precisely what he says in 1:1626. That is, it's not Horace's words themselves that are at fault, but the overall structure of which they form a part. For from Augustine's point of view, Horace's poem is only half true. right? And so we've got these true statements that he makes, but embedded in a broader account of the human and divine worlds that is not fully true. Right? It's half true and half false. His statement, that is Horace's statement about Jupiter, is an instance of just the sort of vinum erroris, the wine of error, with which Augustine faults classical literature in general. And so we might see his creative reuse of Horace in Confessions 1 as an intentional misreading, a Confucian-style rectification of names, by which Augustine takes Horatian words and concepts and then matches them more closely to the reality governed by the true God. Maybe you buy that, maybe you don't. But what of Virgil, whom I have mostly ignored in this analysis? After all, Virgil and his hero Aeneas are much more on the surface of Augustine's discussion of education and pagan learning in Confessions 1 than Horace is. When Augustine looks back on his misspent youth, he sees Virgil. Aeneas's love affair with Dido is the symbol of his own love affair with Latin literature, and Aeneas's fornication with Dido is both the symbol and cause of his own fornication with the world in infidelity to God. As he says in Confessions 1:13-21, I was not loving you, and I was fornicating behind your back. He's talking to God. I was fornicating behind your back, and in my fornication, everyone was saying to me, well done, well done. He should have had virtue as the chaste spouse of his mind, he says, and the bosom of his thought, even as Dido should have been faithful to her vow to her deceased husband Sichaeus. Dido had vowed that she would never marry again, and yet she falls in love with Aeneas. That this is, that this parallel, right, about infidelity, that this is an implicit part of Augustine's point is shown by his well-known, unmarked but metrical quotation of Aeneid 6:457. Augustine says, et haec non flebam et flebam didon extinctam feroque extrema secutam. That last bit is part of a hexameter line from the Aeneid. Augustine says, I was not weeping over these things, the things that he should have been weeping over, and I was weeping over Dido dead and having followed her end by the sword. As Dido had broken her vow and ended up in misery and killed herself, in a similar way, Augustine was unfaithful to God with Dido by reading about Dido and being so sort of obsessed with her and with her literary depiction. So it's true that Virgil is in the foreground. But on the reading here proposed, it is significant that the quotation of Aeneid 6:457 that I just read, which has been much more frequently noticed and discussed, is only the second direct classical quotation in this section, not the first. The first is this little bit in Horace, the Sicis Oculis. And without the Horatian background, the Virgilian foreground loses a good deal of its force and the text loses a layer of its richness. To reprise what was said at the outset, Horace's poem is ostensibly about Virgil's journey to Greece by ship. But it can also be read as an allegorical criticism of Virgil's undertaking in writing the Aeneid, and as a synecdochic and mythological criticism of human audacity in general. The Horatian tag, therefore, cleverly sets the tone of Virgilian criticism at the beginning of Augustine's discussion, at the beginning of Augustine's criticism of Virgil in particular and of pagan literature in general that follows. As Augustine's old schoolmasters used the rod to discipline their wayward pupils, Magister Augustine uses the rod of Horace to discipline wayward pagan poems. Those pagan poems include Horace's own. For as we have seen, Augustine goes on to discipline Horace himself in the rest of Confessions 1 by reading Horace not only against Virgil, but against Horace. Horace had correctly attacked human daring, but his threat of divine vengeance was empty, given that he could harangue his audience with nothing more than a somewhat embarrassing philanderer. It would be odd to use Harvey Weinstein, for example, as an intimidation against immorality. The end result that we get here is a textured picture of various and contradictory moments of reading, as Augustine responds to Horace's response to Virgil in the midst of Augustine's response to Virgil through Horace, in a way that is at once both pro-Horatian because of Horace's polemic against man's audacity, and counter-Horatian because of Horace's mistaken location of the source of divine retribution. Did you get all that? I'm not even sure I did. Far from being a set of dead letters, useful only for mindless reproduction, then, the Roman authors remained for Augustine profoundly alive. Each text a concatenation of mosaic tesserae to be manipulated and reformed, rearranged, put in a new order, in a new context. Indeed, Augustine's elusive practice shows that his view of pagan literature is analogous to his view of the alphabet. As he says of the primae literae, the first letters that you learn, those letters were better because by means of them, this is handout 10, the skill was developing in me and did develop, and I have it still, such that if I come across anything written, I can read it and I can write something myself if I want to, right? Once I know the letters, I can rearrange them in any way that I like. I can read things that I come across, I can write things of my own. In the Confessions, Augustine contrasts this skill explicitly with the utility of his memorization of poetry. But as it turns out, he uses both in exactly the same way, rearranging the primordial elements for his own purposes. And that's it. That's what I had to say. Sorry if that went on too long, but I'm done now.
No, that was fantastic. Okay, so we're going to take a brief 5 to 8 minute break, during which time the participants can place their questions in the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side at the bottom of the Zoom, I don't know, bar or whatever. And at that time, we'll come back and I'll field the questions and Eric will graciously answer them. And we'll probably do Q&A for, 15 to 25 minutes so that we don't keep Eric too late. So anyway, so we'll take a break now. And thank you all for listening. Thank you, Eric, for your lecture. All righty. Well, let's come back. So we have a couple of questions so far, and again, for those of you who are still who are here, it seems like we lost a couple of people, but for those of you who are still here, you can drop questions in the Q&A box at any time if you're interested. So I suppose the first question, I'll just lob you a softball, but so you is basically this: why the asymmetry between Augustine's sort of stated position on Latin literature, which is very explicit and prominent, and then the sort of more complicated view that you attribute to him based on how he uses it, right? Because he has this very forceful rhetoric, but then there's this kind of this much more subtle and charitable interpretation, but the one is foregrounded and the other is sort of not. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually not a softball. I don't think either. I thought about this a lot, it is. I think it's a question of chief importance, and I think it's actually quite difficult to answer. As I said, I don't think obviously that the stuff we find in here is just sort of accidental, like, oh, oops, I just know so much poetry that it just comes out my fingertips or whatever. On the other hand, as you say, his stated position tends to be quite critical. And I think, in fact, it might help to note that Augustine is not actually a unique example of this. His basic position, I think, is Plato's, and I would suggest that Plato does the same thing. If you read through one of the Platonic dialogues, and you see the way that Homer is used or that Hesiod is used. There's this kind of surface critique of poetry and storytelling often, and then you've got Plato himself making up myths, telling stories, referring to poets, interpreting poets, and all that kind of thing. And I don't know. I mean, it seems like kind of a dodge and sort of a squirrely thing to say that maybe there is an unresolved tension in Augustine. I don't know if that's fair to say or not. He's certainly worried about the potential uses of poetry and pagan literature. He has similar kind of worries about music sometimes too, just in general. One sort of fascinating bit of information in this regard is that Augustine tends to be reticent about poetry as a whole. So there are Christians that are contemporaries of his who are writing kind of classicizing poetry in classical verse forms, not just Ambrosian hymns, but actual sort of classic hexameter and lyric poetry, epic, this kind of thing. And he never mentions it. He doesn't even. He surely knew that this stuff existed, and he never talks about it. He never acknowledges its existence. Jerome does, but not much. And it's a very curious thing. And I suppose I don't know, the best thing that I can say about it is that he does seem to have some worries about this kind of thing being used irresponsibly, not least because of what he himself had done when he was younger. And yet there does seem to be room for this kind of sophisticated use that he wants to make of it. And I don't know if that's helpful or not. I mean, there's a parallel to his earliest works that we have. His earliest dialogues are extremely classical. They're little Ciceronian dialogues, and then he kind of quits doing that and starts doing other things. later in his life. And I don't want to say much more than that, because I don't want to sort of attempt to psychologize Augustine. I tend not to like that kind of thing. And so I don't want to sort of plumb his depths to try to figure out the reason for this. I suppose I'm already going on too long, but probably the best thing to say, or the best thing that I can say, is he knows the emotional and imaginative appeal that this literature has, because it had it for him. His initial experience of it in school was not great, both because of the way that he treated it and because of all of the sort of moral difficulties that it was bound up with, from the sort of personalities and practices of his teachers, to the way that it was used in society, to the way that he himself had used it to get ahead and rise to prominence, and that's all connected with his sort of infidelity and wandering away from the faith for a long time. And I don't know, I think he's trying to figure out a way of holding both of those things together, recognizing its appeal and power, while also having a sort of a pretty profound sense of the risks that are involved. I don't want to, but I'm going to suggest it anyway. I don't want to do a sort of Straussian esoteric reading of this, saying that, well, for the masses, you guys better stay away from this, and it's not such a good idea for you guys to meddle with this. But, for the people who maybe have the requisite maturity and know what they're doing, know how to keep this thing in its right place, maybe a little bit of it is okay. Another way of looking at it, maybe this would be better than everything that I just said, is that he's hoping to have readers who have been educated in the same way as he has been. And many of them would probably remain much more attracted to the traditional trappings of Roman culture than Augustine is. And so you could see this as having a sort of intentionally polemical edge too, as if to say, okay, here for my educated readers, yes, you see that I know all of the same literature that you do and everything, but notice how I'm, misreading it or reusing it in a new way to say something that's sort of at cross purposes to some of what it said in the first place. In other words, you don't take this stuff necessarily at face value and then just stop, right? But yes, we share this common cultural background, but look at the critique that I'm making also. Not just the positive use, but also the critical use, and think about that too before you go sort of whole hog, into this sort of thing. I'll stop there. I don't know if any of that's useful or not.
No, that's very helpful. The second question that I have is actually related to the first one, and that is, can you comment at all about the kind of similar rhetorical posture that we find in say like the writings of Saint Jerome, particularly in his vision, so he has this vision, or he says he has this vision, and God tells him to ditch his classical library, and then he in the subsequent decades is still making plenty of use, in the same way that Augustine is to plenty of use of these materials. So like Augustine is part of this broader tradition of polemics against the classics, and so do you see any like connections there between what Augustine's doing and what Jerome's doing?
I do, yeah. And this is what I would say about that. There is a parallel, I think, and to me, because you're right that both of these guys continue to use a lot of this, and I suppose it's possible that it's just because they didn't have to go back and reread because they already knew it all and everything, and so maybe they're not just from time to time picking up and perusing Virgil, Cicero, whatever. Who knows? I suppose that's possible. I don't know that it matters a whole lot though, because this is what I think is the main point, or one of them. If you look at the dream of Jerome in the letter to Eustochium, this vision that he has of being, dragged down to into the underworld and brought before the judge at the tribunal, and he's whipped for which Roman schoolmasters did all the time. He's whipped. He said, "Who are you?" "Well, I'm a Christian." "No, you're not. You're a Ciceronian." "Well, that's a problem, right?" And he says, "I've got a big problem here, and I need to reorient my priorities." If you look at what he says in the dream, and after the dream has passed, what does Jerome do? He starts studying the Bible with a previously unknown devotion. In other words, the main reason I think that his reading of Plautus and Cicero and everything had been such a big problem is because he had let it gain a relative importance much greater than Scripture. And you find this kind of thing you find this in Augustine, right? He says, the first time I read the Bible, man, those guys can't write, right? He found it stylistically offensive. I mean, he then went on to change his mind about that, but he says, I turned from reading Cicero, and I pull this thing open, and I can't read this, it's unreadable. And they take offense, right? People who had, and this is actually very closely, I think, connected to your first question, so thank you for asking it. People who had the kind of education that Augustine and Jerome did were predisposed to turn up their nose at the rhetoric of the Bible because it was so different, and the translations that they had, particularly before Jerome had done his work on the Vulgate, were written in a Latin idiom that was very unelevated, right? So low in terms of its register, and using words improperly and syntax that doesn't follow the rules of syntax as they had learned them. And they would read these things and kind of, again, turn up their nose and say, this is I can't read this, which of course kept them from access to the truth. And what they both come to realize is that the problem was with them, not with the book that they were reading. And I think that does play into the worries that both of them have about, this kind of snobbishness that can result from the education that each of them had, such that they would kind of turn away in revulsion from the Bible, which is, of course, a very bad thing for a Christian to do. And so part of what each of them is doing is relativizing the status that the great Roman authors had, which was a big deal still in the 4th century and the 5th century, to say, it's fine, but it's not the greatest thing ever, or there are things that are more important than it. That's a really radical thing to say. And they're both saying it, and I think they're saying it for similar reasons in that respect. And that's why they feel, more free to critique those texts, which is not something that they're going to do with the Bible, obviously, for instance. But yeah, I do think those things are related, and they have to do with, again, with relative priorities and with certain potentially sinful attitudes that are adopted by those who don't think kind of carefully and critically enough about their posture, the kind of posture that they have toward the things that they're reading, is what I would say.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Eric, for this lecture, for answering questions. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me.
Yep.